valued above all other things. Failure is probably the most loaded word in the language, in any language. But let's demystify it for a moment. Failure is simply the gap between where you want to go and where you end up. It is probably the most universal and most common human experience. And that's why we've been trying to make ourselves feel better about it for thousands of years, trying to come to grips with this. And today, in our world, in our present society, we have an entire self-help industry that has grown up around trying to help us come to grips with this concept of failure in our daily lives. And you'll see that this is where I stole the title for my talk, so thank you, Oprah. We're actually beginning to see a transformation largely driven, I believe, by an increasingly entrepreneurial economy and by the digital revolutions remaking global societies. We're beginning to see a changing dialogue about failure where it's being integrated into our thinking about how we improve and move forward as a society. So you hear phrases like fail forward increasingly in all walks of life except one. Now, the foundation field, the philanthropy field, loves to talk about risk. When you talk with people who do this sort of work professionally, the way we view ourselves is as society's risk capital. We believe that because we're able to do things in philanthropy that governments can't do and that businesses aren't set up to do. So philanthropy is able to take risks that the rest of society can't on behalf of those who are less fortunate. But when you look at how foundations talk about risk, when you read our fancy websites, and when you look at our fancy annual reports, and when you engage in conversations about the wonderful work that we do, everybody talks about their successes. And when they talk about risk, it looks like this. We have to be, in my opinion, the best gamblers in the entire world because apparently everything we do works. In our family, in the philanthropic family, the family of people who are engaged in this work, here's how I think we look at failure. Failure is the proverbial mad uncle who lives in the attic. We all know he's up there, but nobody likes to talk about him, and certainly nobody likes to acknowledge the fact of his existence. And absolutely nobody knows what to do with him. And there are 5 simple reasons for that. I'm going to quickly walk you through these because I think the starting point for recovery is self-awareness. You can probably come up with a dozen of your own, but these 5 are, to me, the core ones that we have to come to grips with if we're going to get better as a field and as a practice. We must understand that the first reason we don't want to talk about failure is that, like every other human being on the planet, we don't want to. Maxine Maltby, a psychologist, came up years ago with the idea that there are 4 fears that kill our dreams and that kill our desire to pursue the things that we really want to make happen. That's why he called them the fatal fears. To me, the granddaddy of them all is rejection because it brings along all the other fears with it. We are terrified, the fear of failure is the chief one. We are terrified of failing. And we're terrified of failing not just because inherently we don't like to fail, but because we don't like to be wrong. We don't like to be rejected, and we certainly hate the emotional discomfort that comes along with failure. But unlike everybody else on the planet, we actually don't have to in this line of work. I actually talked with some of you last night, and I was very privileged to be able to participate in a number of conversations about this. And I want to confess that I killed every conversation I was in as soon as I said that I was talking about failure the next day. I don't think I'm that bad a conversationalist, by the way, but it was every conversation, because nobody knows where to go with this. In our field, we actually don't have the normal incentives that would come along in a for-profit business or in a highly competitive nonprofit environment. Because when what you do is give away money, there is no market to tell you whether you're right or wrong. There is no bottom line to tell you whether you're doing well or not. And you get to decide whether you want to put in the feedback loops to give you that information. Complicating this even further is that we're not even sure it matters. Many of the folks that I talk to about this subject, the first thing they say is, well, there really isn't failure in philanthropy. So we have an idea that this doesn't matter in our line of work. A little more than 10 years ago, I was involved with an initiative at the Heinz Endowments. We were taking on this huge, ambitious assignment to provide quality early education to every student in our community who needed it. And somebody actually said this to me at the time. Look, even if we fail, the worst that can happen is we educate a few kids. I'm going to come back to this concept because it's critical to how we need to view this differently. Complicating matters even further is the fact that nobody, and I mean nobody, deep down in their heart, really believes what the famous American philanthropist Andrew Carnegie said over a century ago. Andrew Carnegie said that it was harder to give away money well than to make it. And I can tell you that culturally, no one believes this. We do not celebrate people in our culture for giving away money well. We celebrate people for making money. We occasionally celebrate people for giving away a lot of money, but it's all about amount, not about quality. Celebrating the quality of work is not something we do in our culture, and no one wants to fail at something that everybody else in the society considers to be easy. Finally, there's a social psychologist at Stanford named Carol Dweck who has studied mindsets around risk. And she's looked at two mindsets. One is a growth mindset, which believes that you can actually grow your skills and intelligence by taking on new challenges. The other is a fixed mindset that believes, like many people do, that skills and intelligence are actually innate or fixed at birth. What she found in her research, one aspect of it was particularly fascinating. It was that people who are praised for their abilities, and I'm looking at Sarah because she knows this better than I do, but when you are dealing with people who are praised for their abilities, what happens is that they are inclined to develop more of a fixed mindset. And when they develop more of a fixed mindset, what happens is that they begin to seek out affirmation of those abilities rather than to take on new challenges. The more you're praised for your abilities, the less risk you're willing to take on, the less likely you are to want to incur failure. And folks, when you enter the world of philanthropy, and I want you to be honest about this, and it doesn't matter if you're a professional staffer who's privileged to work in this world, or if you are the absolute genius who created the company that spun off the money that created the philanthropy. It doesn't matter. When you enter this world, you have entered the Greek god phase of being praised for your abilities. There's an old joke in philanthropy that when the day you walk in the door of a foundation, you'll never get a bad meal or hear an honest opinion again. And it's unfortunately true, and it has direct effects on our ability to take on new challenges. Now, there have been great exceptions. I mentioned one earlier. Paul Brest at Hewlett has actually talked about this a lot and the need for foundations to overcome their egos. There have been some heroic exceptions from foundations where they've delivered great reports on, I sort of refer to these as when we failed. And it's a great confession, and it does a lot for the field to be able to embrace moments like this, but they haven't ignited a revolution. We're not seeing a field that is embracing this mindset, and here's why. Too much of what has happened so far is that we've talked about the need to talk about failure. And we do need to talk about failure differently. But what we really need to do as a field and as a group of people who want to repair the world is think differently about failure. So what I'm going to suggest to you this morning is, very quickly, are 7 principles that if we embrace them, if we embrace these 7 principles, I believe we would remake philanthropy overnight. Not in a necessarily coherent way, but we would see a lot more creativity in the field than we do now. I also refer to these as 7 ways to bring our mad uncle down and make him part of the family again. So the first is simply accept that failure matters. This idea that failure doesn't happen in our field is a load of baloney. This is something called the play pump. It's a wonderful invention. When it came out, like everybody else in the world, I thought this was the coolest thing ever. This pump was designed to ease the burden of extracting water for African villages, which was done with a hand pump that consumed hours of villagers' time to bring water to the surface. And the play pump, this colorful device, was going to harness the power of children at play to bring water to the surface. Everybody thought this was the best thing ever. It became the darling of international aid organizations. Huge amounts of money were pumped into it. This became the standard for water delivery in Africa until a curious aid worker went around and started observing what happened after the foreign visitors went away and the cameras were turned off. And guess what? Children didn't play on the play pump. It blurred the lines between work and play in their communities. And what ended up happening when the visitors were gone was that children and women in the village ended up rotating the play pump manually, not playing on it, but rotating it manually, and that meant that they had to work twice as hard as they had when they were using the regular pump. Now, every story I'm going to share with you has a silver lining, and there are silver linings behind that one. But I want you to focus on the cost for a moment of that. There was a real cost associated with that failure. The second principle that I'd like you to walk away with today is that failure matters even when we don't cause it. In this field, even those who will acknowledge that there is such a thing as failure like to believe that it's only the things that we cause by touching them. If you believe in Tikkun Olam, I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but if you believe in this concept of repairing the world, then part of what you have to accept is that we are taking ownership of the challenges that we're attempting to solve. So this statement, come on, in philanthropy isn't surgery. This was a comment made to me by a doctor friend of mine when we were debating failure in our professions one day. And he said, look, it's not surgery. Nobody dies when something happens like this. I like to contrast that with the work done by a friend of mine, one of my heroes in philanthropy, a woman named Karen Feinstein, who heads the Jewish Healthcare Foundation in Pittsburgh. A decade ago, she launched a program designed to get the huge international Heart Health Association organizations to focus on the special needs of women's health and heart disease. And when she talked about that initiative at the time, she spoke every day about the women who were dying as a result of lack of awareness about this problem. She takes on in her work hard issues like high hospital infection rates. And the way she talks about the cost of failure in her work is people will die. Now, she doesn't have to own that. She doesn't have to take that on because she's not causing it. But what she's recognizing is that there are countdowns that are happening every day in the world around us that by taking them on philanthropically, we're promising to help solve. So if we're not succeeding in that, if we're failing in that, then there is a consequence that we at least have to acknowledge. Now, the first principle will cause a change in behavior that will lead you to set targets so that you know how you're doing. The second principle will cause you to want to measure your progress against them, against the thing that you're trying to change. The third principle goes back to the story that I told you at the beginning. When we fear failure, it is just as bad as ignoring failure. Fear of failure is just another way to fail. When we continue to fund programs that we know don't work, or that we suspect don't work, when we play it safe with organizations that we think may be effective, but we're not really sure, we are as complicit in failure as when we go out and do something that's blatantly stupid on the face of it. If you can accept that, if you can move to the level of thinking that fear of failure is as bad as failure, now I've put you in a catch-22. And that catch-22 seems to be if you know failure matters, then you don't want to take a risk. But if you know fear of failure is just as bad, now you have to think about, do I take a risk or not? And then you get into the concept of integrating failure as a learning tool or as an improvement tool. In his great book, Little Bets, Peter Sims provides the example of the comedian Chris Rock, who goes out and road tests every one of his huge international blockbuster comedy routines by doing little snippets of comedy in little tiny venues around his home. And he goes in and he bombs. Half the time he bombs. And this is a guy with a great reputation. He doesn't want to put it at risk, but he goes and he road tests every single joke with people in a small venue. And the reason he does that is he can contain the damage while he's learning about what routines work and what don't. What does that look like in philanthropy? That sounds so easy, but it's hard to... One of the simplest ways is simply to accept that you are not an expert on everything. So one of the biggest problems that we're facing in the United States right now is the death of investigative journalism. And the Knight Foundation in Miami has taken on this challenge because they come out of journalism. That's where their money came from. And one of the ways they're trying to solve this is not by inventing a new brand of journalism, because to be honest, they don't know what the solution is. So instead, what they're doing is seeding little programs all around the country. Some that take advantage of national resources like TED, others that are completely homegrown and that use investigative journalism resources. We've launched one in Pittsburgh where we're basically hiring our own investigative reporters to keep the community honest. What Knight knows about this is a lot of these are going to fail. A lot of their experiments are going to fail, but what they want to do is encourage the field to identify new ways of addressing the journalism deficit. If we can become comfortable with the concept of failure as a tool for improvement, we can then become comfortable with the idea of escaping the things that are so safe in our philanthropy. If I have one concern about philanthropy and the way it is generally done, is that we so often love to play it safe because it is so easy. The founder of Performance Space 122, Mark Russell, it's an experimental performance space in New York City, likes to describe his performance space as a temple of failure. What he deliberately tried to do was bring people, artists, into this space to try new things that often bombed with critics. But that wasn't the point. The point wasn't whether it was successful or bombed with critics. The point was whether the artists learned some new techniques and did something new and advanced the art. So what does that look like for us in philanthropy? Well, if you want to stay with the arts for a moment, it means that in addition to funding something wonderful and established like the Israel Philharmonic, maybe we can fund something that's wacko and out there like Eddie Izzard. And maybe we can experiment in the field by expanding our own horizons about what we are willing to fund to take on the edgy and the experimental and not just the safe. If we can accomplish that, we can get to a point where we can begin to view our grant making, our funding, our philanthropy, however you want to refer to it, as an investment portfolio. A lot of folks in this room, have made a lot of money, I suspect, by being very astute investors. And very astute investors know that you take safe bets and you take risky bets. Well, the same should be true in anybody's philanthropy portfolio. In his great book on why failure always leads to success, a book called Adapt, Tim Harford laid out these examples of the National Institutes of Health and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Two different ways of advancing learning and science around human health. The National Institutes of Health are the ultimate safe player. They take small incremental bets on science that builds on established knowledge and moves knowledge incrementally along the chain. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute takes huge transformative leaps of intuition and invests in wild leaps of innovation. What's interesting is that both of these models lead to significant innovation at roughly the same rate. A healthy ecosystem of innovation includes both. So if you want in your grant making, if we want our philanthropy to be maximally effective, we would combine both some degree of risk and some extraordinary degree of risk. Finally, I would like to, the seventh of these principles is to remember that it is not about us. This is the hardest one sometimes to remember in this field. The issue is not our egos, the issue is not our reputations, the issue is not really, at the end of the day, what we believe is important or must happen, but the needs of the world we are trying to repair. If we can remember that, it puts us in a position to begin designing grant making from a point of empathy, to begin designing grant making, our philanthropy, from a perspective of what the world really needs, as opposed to what we want or find convenient. Finally, I want to end on a note of thanks. This is a little bit about who I am, but this is my grandmother, Maria de Vries. During World War II, Maria was a member of the Dutch Underground, living in Amsterdam, and for a year sheltered a young Jewish girl named Nell in her house. They were ultimately betrayed by a neighbor, And 3 armed men appeared in her house late at night, put a gun to Maria's head, and said, "You have 10 seconds to tell us the name of your contacts in the resistance." Maria refused. Nell was hauled away. She wasn't killed. Maria wasn't killed. Nell survived the war, we found out later. But those 10 seconds, for me, capture everything about the essence of our work. There are countdowns like that happening all around us every single day. The world is counting down on issues like climate change or violence or spousal abuse, hunger, poverty, and that can be measured in real lives. But my grandmother taught me a lesson or two about perseverance and strength. We are called upon by moments like we face in this work to take the risks and to admit failure when we encounter it and to learn from it and to grow from it. I find that to be an extraordinarily enriching way of looking at the world. I also want to say that my grandmother's example gave me her story and her values, gave me a deep love of the Jewish people and of the state of Israel. And so most of all, I want to thank you for your extraordinary gift to me of your invitation, your attention, and your work. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sarah Stein Greenberg, Managing Director of the Stanford Design School.
Good morning. All right, Grant, we are so aligned. I'm also going to talk about Carol Dweck this morning. This should feel like part 2 of the same thought that just got started. So thank you also for having me here this morning. It's also my first time in Israel. I'm incredibly happy to be here. I have the pleasure and the privilege to work at the Stanford Design School. And the first thing that I want to say about that is that it's neither a school, nor do we actually teach design in the traditional sense. So let me be a little more specific about what we do actually do. When we got started, the last thing that we thought Stanford needed was a separate school where all the creative people would go and be sequestered away from everyone else in the university. Instead, our belief is that there is incredible creative potential in all students in the university. And although they are getting degrees in these highly analytical, linear disciplines like engineering and medicine and business, we want that future doctor to be exercising creativity when she's redesigning the patient experience. We want that business student to be delighting his customers when he's coming up with a new product. And so what the D School really is an opportunity for people coming from these radically different disciplines to work together in a creative space. And that's what the D School is. We think of it as a school crossing rather than an independent school. Often when you hear organizations who work on innovation talk about innovation, what they're really talking about are the ideas or the products. And sometimes they'll even talk about the process of innovation. But we actually have a little bit of a different take. We try to focus on the innovator, and particularly those students that we think are the future innovators. And having this kind of focus allows us to really be looking at how to nurture that capability that we believe is resident in all of our students. So given our innovator focus, I would be remiss if I did not start my talk this morning with a story about some of our extraordinary students. So when we get these students from varying disciplines together, what we do is we throw really messy, hairy problems at them. Problems where there's no obvious right answer. We as the faculty, we don't know the right answer. And they actually have to come together and do some work that requires them to identify what is the right problem to be solving. So this is a story about a group of students who tackled a project around designing less expensive incubators for use in places like Nepal. And you may have actually heard about the outcome of this story. The students who worked on this project have been featured on ABC's 2020, in the New York Times. One of the students is now a TED Fellow, because they actually came out with a pretty amazing and transformative product, which I'll tell you about. But as we're going through this story, what I want you to really be listening for are the process elements and really the journey where we're trying to intersect with our students. So the framing of this project was build a cheaper incubator for Nepal. Incubators in the West, when they're new, cost about $20,000 US. A lot of times in the developing world, the hospitals are using a hand-me-down that they got from a European donor typically. When those machines break, it's very hard to find replacement parts locally, and often they go idle or unused. So the first thing that our students did was actually travel to the context where this was taking place. We don't believe that it's possible to design or to innovate when you don't actually have deep empathy for the context in which you're designing. And one could argue that that was part of what was at play with the play pump that Grant mentioned, a lack of real understanding about the cultural context that the inventors were designing for. So the picture on the far right of the screen is actually a shot that one of our students took from inside a hospital in Kathmandu where they were doing their observation and their empathy work. And what they noticed was that actually there were several incubators that were in pretty good working condition, but there were no infants in them. And our student asked the doctor who was on call, can you tell me about why there are no babies here? And the doctor said, well, actually most babies, like most people in Nepal, they're born in the rural areas. Almost 80% or more are born in the rural areas. And it's very hard for the parents to bring them into the hospital. So often, we actually don't get to use these incubators, even though we've managed to keep them working. So the student really took that in. And I think it would have been easy at that point for him to say, okay, well, tell me about your utilization rate, how often are they used, and then to go back into design around that situation. But what he actually heard in that doctor's comment was a much richer opportunity that he wanted to investigate. So he ditched the rest of his itinerary. This is another thing we teach at the D School, which is breaking the rules. And he hopped on a bus, and he left the capital, and he went and he actually found and interviewed a rural healthcare provider. And when he found this doctor in a rural clinic, the doctor told him a story of a delivery that he had made just a few weeks before, where the infant was very low birth weight. And she said, doctor, respectfully, I appreciate your advice, but I cannot afford to take that trip. I can't pay for it, and I can't afford to be away from my farm. So the doctor gave the mother a blanket, and she wrapped up the baby and took him home, and a few days later, he died. And this student who heard this story, he could not let it go. And even though this was not the set of directions that he had received about what this project was about, he took that
is and what their need is. And that's probably the place where you have to spend the most amount of time ever, because that pretty much sets the trend for what happens later on.
We had to decide where we're going to design for. Are we going to design for extreme remote areas? Are we going to design for something in between? So on the one hand, there's a clear need here for something that will work in rural areas. On the other hand, there's the engineer in me telling me, dude, that's going to be hard. We had mixed opinions on this, right? Some people on the team wanted to do the more remote setting. Others wanted to do something, and I was one of the others who was caught in two minds. Should we actually be doing something more tractable, right? That can actually be done by the end of the class. We were stuck here, and finally we get one of the TAs in this class. We presented her with what we are facing, and she said, given a choice, I'd say go after the hard challenge. See, this is what puts the extreme in extreme affordability. So, okay, fine. we'll see what we can do with the more rural setting. And so our POV became what it is.
Our point of view, the user is a desperate parent living in a remote village who needs the means to give her dying baby a chance to survive. So that's how we reframe the problem. It's no longer about the clinician, but about the parent.
We've also taken a step back from incubators, and we're saying that we're trying to give these babies a chance to survive.
That's where we defined the problem, and that's where we said, all right, we're going to try to do something, and we always, for this user and for this need, and we always we posted it on our sort of our whiteboard, and we'll always go back and say, okay, are we still addressing this point of view? You know, after every time we come up with a prototype and every time we do an iteration or something like that, are we still focusing, you know, are we still making sure that we're reaching this user and meeting their needs?
So that's a little bit about the choice point that this team really faced. And as you heard, when they actually took that step back from incubators, what they started thinking about was the challenge, the core challenge of how to keep a baby warm outside of a hospital context. And so they took this completely reframed problem and they started prototyping. So they designed sketches. With this idea of how to keep a baby warm, they hit on the idea of a sleeping bag. They went to the Salvation Army and they bought every used sleeping bag that they could find, and they learned how to sew, and they started sewing mock-ups of sleeping bags and taking them over to the Stanford hospital, to the NICU, and getting feedback from the expert nurses who were there about what the features might need to be. And what you see on the lower left-hand side is a white packet of wax inside the sleeping bag. So the way that this product actually works is it uses what's called a phase change material, which is a material that's changing between solid and liquid. And when you put this packet of very inexpensive wax either in an electric warmer or in a pot of boiling water, if you happen to be in a context that doesn't have electricity, you heat up the wax, you put it into a separate pouch where the baby is protected in its own little compartment. And as it cools back down to a solid, it actually maintains a temperature that's almost identical to human body temperature. So in a very, very inexpensive way, these students have basically created a substitute that does almost 80% of what an incubator does, which is to provide warmth. And this is a model that actually can work almost anywhere in the world. So this group of students, when they graduated from Stanford, they moved to India. They started doing clinical trials. They were quite successful in refining their product. They signed a distribution deal with GE Healthcare, and they're now making and distributing this infant warmer in places like China and Somalia and India. So this is an incredible story that has a remarkable outcome. But what I think is most compelling for us at the D School is that this is a story of students who chose to solve a harder problem. So when they started, this team had never met each other before. They were not experts in incubation or child health care. And they had what Rahul, who is the student in the video who says, dude, this is going to be hard. They had a really healthy self-interest in doing well in the conventional frame that Stanford puts on them, right? Like, these were students who don't really get A minuses. And the idea of setting themselves against a challenge where they couldn't see the end, they weren't sure that they were going to be successful, that was really scary. So I'm filled with awe every time I think about this group of students because they really made this courageous choice to tackle the harder problem. And to me, this is really what education is about, right? It's actually not about getting students to solve a problem where the faculty member has solved it before, it's a problem set, we know the answers, right? It's to do what Eric Hoffer talks about when he said, the central task of education is to implant a will and a facility for learning. It should produce not learned, but learning people. And in a time of drastic change, it is the learners who inherit the future. The learned usually find themselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. So as Grant was saying, the psychologist Carol Dweck has talked about this from a slightly different perspective, this idea of the fixed versus the growth mindset. We're highly aligned this morning. And what I think you saw in that video was Rahul really shifting from this fixed mindset to one of growth, where he said to himself, okay, we're going to give this a shot. We're going to stop trying to demonstrate our absolute quantity of intelligence and talent. We're actually going to see if we can grow and if we can learn by trying something harder. And I think that the challenge that we're up against in design thinking and design education is how do we get adults like Rahul, like many of us, who were raised to value knowing and expertise and fixed intelligence to take on those kinds of risks. I believe that the methodology used by designers is actually one of those ways. So I would say fully half of our process, this latter half that's in color, is really about experimentation. Is about testing your ideas in an unformed way through prototyping, exposing those to people who might have a very critical opinion, who might tell you you're not on the right track, and then iterating based on that feedback. That takes a level of sublimating one's ego. It takes a willingness to really listen to those divergent perspectives. And that's something that we see our students have to, that's a conscious behavior that they have to adopt. They don't come into our classes very comfortable showing off unfinished work. But the process inherently rewards that effort that's spent on taking risks. And one way to think about that is that when we say fail early, fail often, which you see all over the press right now, this concept of early prototyping is really about reducing the cost of risk. Right? So if you get feedback about an idea very early on in the development process that you're not on the right track, you have time to course correct. So a failure at that point is really an opportunity for learning. It's really valuable information that you can't afford to ignore. When you don't prototype until late in the project, the level of risk and the cost of a mistake is much, much higher. Prototypes can be of many varieties. We talk a lot with our students about this idea of low resolution prototyping. So when you prototype early on, you're not even sure about the full scope of your idea that you're trying to bring to life. So you might build something that doesn't have full functionality, but you're trying to test how it should feel in someone's hand, like the bowl on the left. You might prototype an environment to see how people react. Or you might prototype an experience like the students on the right who are trying to prototype around communication between a child and a parent who are reading to each other at a distance through Skype. These kinds of low resolution prototypes really invite a kind of feedback that's very constructive and very affirming. It's different than when you ask someone for validation, and instead it's asking someone to participate and co-design with you, and that's extremely powerful if you're showing these prototypes to people who think differently than you. Very quick example of rapid prototyping in action. We had a group of students a few years ago who were determined to really redesign the experience of getting news on the iPad or the iPhone. And so they took their ideas to a coffee shop in Palo Alto. They're sort of very, very accomplished computer scientists, so they were able to quickly code a prototype, show it to anyone in the coffee shop that was willing to look at it, get feedback. An hour later, they'd recoded, they'd taken the bugs out, they'd come up with new ideas for the interface. And by doing that cycle through the course of a day, they were able to radically accelerate their product development process. 6 weeks later, they had gone from just a concept to a product that was earning revenue. And a few weeks after that, they were being heralded by Steve Jobs as an example of the vibrant developer community that Apple depends on. This is a company called Pulse. So I want to wrap up with just a couple of thoughts about how prototyping and learning, having a growth mindset, might apply to philanthropy. I think there's two aspects. One is around the shift in mindset, and the other is how you can cultivate an active prototyping practice. So I want to offer some ideas for 3 thought experiments that might be fun to do sometime while you're here at the conference, where you can bounce these ideas off of your colleagues. So first experiment is, what did you do the last time something unexpected happened after you gave a gift? Did you tell everyone you knew about it and explain how terribly you'd fail and get lots of feedback about what you might do the next time? Or did you maybe chalk it up to luck or kind of say, well, that was an unfortunate outcome, we're going to do better next time? how would you direct your money this year if your chief objective was to learn as rapidly as possible? Not to say that impact isn't important, but if your real goal was to learn, how would you allocate your funds? And third, how could you trigger more unexpected results from your giving to rapidly accelerate your learning? And in terms of what a prototype in philanthropy might look like, here are some ideas. I don't think these are the only ideas. I would turn to all of you to actually come up with even more relevant concepts. But first, I would say, be a learner, not a knower, right? So show unfinished work to get to others to get feedback, and particularly challenge yourself to show them to people who you think might criticize or might have a divergent perspective. Show them to a grantee, show them to someone who's a peer who you admire or who you think outperforms you in some way. Fail early and often. Put your ideas out into the world before you have all the answers. This feels risky, but it's when you get the best and most constructive feedback. Start low resolution. So what would it look like to make a series of small gifts to an organization or an issue that you were trying to learn about, lowering your own transactional costs around participating, and then increase the amount of your gift as you get more confident about what to expect. And finally, aim for variance. So fund more than one approach in a given issue space and learn from the outcomes. So my final thought. I believe that we really are in these times of drastic change, as Eric Hoffer said. And I think that in addition to this concept of risk capital, that philanthropists have this ability to take risks in a way that no one else in society does, I want to add the concept of learning capital. I think that one of the unique roles that you can play in our society is the ability to help us figure out how to solve some of the messiest problems that we face. We don't, as a society, know how to solve the problem of global hunger, or how to educate girls in rural villages in developing countries, or how to build prosperity and protect our planetary resources at the same time. And I think to get to those answers, we have to adopt this learning mindset, and we have to figure out how to learn more quickly. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sir Ronald Cohen, Chairman of the Portland Trust.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I could not have hoped for two better presentations to lead to the comments that I would like to make today. Because the reality about our society is that while our system deals with its economic and its financial consequences admirably, and we can see that in the current financial crisis, the system does not deal with its social consequences. And about 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, charity came into the picture to try and provide a solution. But philanthropy has only managed to go so far. And over the past 50 or 60 years, government tried to provide a solution. We got the development of the welfare state. And despite huge investment in resources of every kind, many of the social issues that you confront in your everyday life as a philanthropist persist and even get worse. It's as if our system leads to an increase in the average standard of living, but an increasing gap between rich and poor. And those who are poor stay poor. Those who are at the bottom, who get left behind, are mired in disadvantage and broken values and don't know how to escape from their predicament. And so when in 2000 I got a phone call from the British Treasury to say, would I, with my eye as an entrepreneur and a venture capitalist, begin to look at this issue of poverty and how we might be able to deal with it, I immediately said yes. And we brought together a group, very interesting, Sarah, your comment, because we brought together a group that didn't know each other, of 8 or 9 people, from the financial sector and from the social sector. And we began to look completely objectively at the role of government and the role of philanthropy and the problems of society. And we came to a conclusion that I would like to share with you, and I would like to share some of the insights that I've gained in the 12 years since then, and give you a sense that philanthropy really must evolve now into social investment. And the reason is that we discovered that everybody talks of the private sector and the public sector. But there is between those two sectors a social sector, often called the voluntary sector or the third sector, which all of us in this room inhabit. And this sector is considerable in size. In the United States, it has $700 billion of foundation assets. It has 9 million people working in charitable organizations of one kind or another. And yet, what is the common characteristic of all the service providers in the sector, as you know better than anybody else? It is that nobody has any money. That when philanthropists give money, they say, we don't want you to spend money on your overheads. We want the money to go to the object of your charity. And if somebody had come to me at Apex and said, I want to build a successful business that's going to revolutionize my sector, and I'm not going to spend any money on my overheads and on my team and on my organization, I would have shown the person the door. And yet, in the social sector, that's how we've operated. And what I would like to put before you today is that the social sector, which we in this hall inhabit, is really the missing part of the system, the part that should be dealing with social consequences. But it should be dealing with them in ways that go beyond charity, beyond traditional philanthropy. And we began to define in 2000 this area of social investment, which basically said capitalism has let down the poor. It's let down the poor in many ways, but in one way in particular, which is that the tools of capitalism, which are creativity and entrepreneurship and capital markets, those tools have never really been placed at the hands of social entrepreneurs. And that is what we have to try to achieve today. And we began to focus on what would be required in order to give social entrepreneurs the same access to capital and human resources that business entrepreneurs have had. After all of us in this room are evidence of the fact that we don't think that society is operating properly, and that we need to play an important role in order to maintain social cohesion and a sense of fairness about our society. But the tools haven't been there. Well, the tools over the last 12 years have been developed to a large extent. And those tools are beginning to be applied in several countries. I'm glad to say that the UK and the United States and Australia and Canada and Israel are leaders in this effort. And I'd like to point, first of all, to the fact that if we begin to try to be creative about social issues and step back from what we're doing, then we can begin to innovate in really major ways. And the first innovation I would like to talk to you about is the social impact bond. The social impact bond resulted from the fact that this work, which has been going on for several years, had come to the conclusion that we need to create a social investment bank in every country to connect social entrepreneurs to the capital markets. And we identified unclaimed assets. These are assets lying in banks, people's accounts, people who've died, who've moved away, people who've forgotten about their money, which are hundreds of millions of pounds in the case of the UK. And we began to make a case to the government that we should use this money in order to begin to innovate, and in order to begin to bring about nothing short of a revolution in the way in which we fund the social sector. The government accepted the proposition in the UK, but wanted to give us insufficient amount of money, so we put together this social investment bank. We started off with one person, 3 or 4 of us funded it. There are now 30 people. And in 2007, we set off to try to innovate. In 2010, we signed up the British government for the first social impact bond, and I'd like to describe it to you. We went to the government and we said, look, you have a problem with young prisoners who are incarcerated before the age of 21. 2/3 of them reoffend within 1 year of release in almost every country. I'm sure some of you who are nodding their heads are involved with this issue. We will raise £5 million to deal with the prisoners leaving Peterborough prison near Cambridge. If over the next 6 to 8 years, through 3 not-for-profits who are working with these prisoners, we fail to reduce the rate of reoffending relative to the rest of the country by 7.5%, then the money's lost. If, on the other hand, these not-for-profits succeed in reducing the rate of reoffending by 7.5% to 15%, then government will pay back the £5 million and will pay a return of 2.5% a year up to 13% a year, depending on the extent of the reduction. And the punchline is government would only be paying out 1/3 of the saving. For the first time, I think, a social entrepreneur working in the St. Giles Trust, a not-for-profit that's been around for 40 years or more, dependent on grants, can say, if I achieve a social performance, a reduction of 10%, in the cohort of Peterborough Prison over the next 6 years, I can pay out 7.5% on my bond. If I can achieve a 15% reduction, I can pay 13%. And what is the impact for the social entrepreneur? The impact for the social entrepreneur is to say, you know what, philanthropy gave me the first layer of equity for my organization, allowed me to put my team in place to test out different approaches to take the risks that Grant was talking about in the first presentation today. But now I need capital for expansion, and I need somebody to recognize my social performance. And if I do better than others, then I ought to attract more capital. And as a not-for-profit, I will have a revenue model. I will no longer be solely dependent on philanthropy, because out of the return that the investors achieve, I will keep a portion to fund the expansion of my organization, so that I can deal not just with Peterborough Prison, but with all of the prisons in a certain area of the UK. Now, as we know, social returns do not attract capital in the way that financial returns do. In my experience as a venture capitalist, private equity investor, every time I managed to deliver a 30% net IRR, I had investors rushing to put money into my fund. But if somebody is achieving a social return, it's very difficult to raise capital. And so you do need to create an organization which is a social investment bank, a wholesaler of capital. And I'm very proud to say that in the UK, we've now succeeded in doing this. And Big Society Capital is the first social investment bank. It's being funded to the tune of £400 million by unclaimed assets from the leading banks and building societies in the UK. The 4 major UK banks are adding another £200 million of equity. We will have £600 million of equity, nearly $1 billion, with which to underwrite social impact bond issues, just as you underwrite the issues of any security that a business entrepreneur would like to issue, to cornerstone social investment funds of various kinds, some which are supporting social entrepreneurs who will not be able to pay a very high rate of return, perhaps 3 or 4%, but will be able to deliver a high social return, all the way through to funds like the Bridges funds, which I've been privileged to co-found and to chair for the last 10 years, which invest venture capital only in the poorest parts of Britain, where, if you like, the locomotive is the financial return and the carriages are the social returns. And when we raised the first Bridges fund in 2002, we promised investors 10 to 12% net IRR. We're in fact delivering 17 to 20% net IRR. because the level of motivation in poorer areas is higher than it is in the mainstream economy. And the business models that you begin to develop in those areas are more effective in terms of their use of capital and more sensitive in terms of their price levels. And I could give you a number of examples of this. Now, where does Israel fit in? Israel is a leader in technological entrepreneurship. And I'm, again, proud to say that I played a small role in this because in 1993, I raised the first institutional fund to come and invest in technology in Israel. Nobody thought then that Israel could become a technological power comparable to the United States, to Silicon Valley, ahead of Europe, ahead of Germany, ahead of France, ahead of the UK, where in all of which countries I was involved. Israel faces a number of very important social issues. Its skill at improvisation, the energy and the dynamism of its population make it, in my view, one of the very clear potential leaders in this field of social investment. Up until now, you have funded through your grants. The time has come for you to start funding through your balance sheets as well. What do I mean by this? When we went to raise the Peterborough bond, we went to people similar to you in the UK, 17 of them invested in the first bond. How many do you think of the 17 paid the money out of their grant allocation? What proportion paid it out of their grant allocation? And what proportion kept it on their balance sheet as an investment because they believed the money would come back and interest would accrue on it? So what percentage do you think kept it on their balance sheet? Can I have any bids, please? None? 40%, 20%, 67%. 2/3 of the foundations and charitable trusts that invested in the first social impact bond kept it on their balance sheet as an investment. It makes no sense in any of our countries. If you come from the United States, it makes no sense that we have $700 billion sitting on foundation balance sheets and $35 billion being given each year. If we begin to allocate 5% of our balance sheet to funding, which is in the nature of social investment that will come back with a combination of a social and an investment return, we more than double the amount of money that is going to deal with social issues today. But more importantly, we begin to give a path for social entrepreneurs to scale up, to raise the capital that they need to move the needle on social issues. We're working in Israel now to prepare a number of social impact bond issues. We're also working with the Milken Institute, with Yad HaNadiv. There's an excellent report on the capital, the social capital market in Israel on the Yad HaNadiv website. Yad HaNadiv is, as many of you probably know, the Rothschild family charitable foundation. Does a lot of work in Israel. I'm proud to be a member of its board. And if you go to that site, you will find a detailed report about the prospects of creating a social capital market in Israel. We will need some of you to subscribe to social impact bond issues. We will need some of you to persuade government here that using unclaimed assets in Israeli banks, in Israeli pension funds, in Israeli insurance companies for social purposes is something that we need to do. And as Israel achieves the status of a surplus country, begins to create a sovereign fund to collect capital from the taxation that is levied on gas exploration and so on, so the need to issue Israel bonds in the traditional way will decline. And so I believe the need to raise social impact bonds to deal with the low standards of education in Israel, with issues about the inclusion of immigrant populations, with issues about homelessness, about drug rehabilitation, about recidivism, all the issues that we see in all of our countries, which are exacerbated by this widening gap now in an entrepreneurial society between rich and poor. Through the Portland Trust, whose goal is to use the economic drivers in order to achieve peace with our Palestinian neighbors, and through our offices in London, in Tel Aviv, and in Ramallah, we have tried to do two things. One is to develop the Palestinian private sector, growth. Palestinian economy last year was about 8%, the year before was about 10%. There is a huge peace dividend, and we're beginning to show Palestinians that it is there and that it is within grasp. On the Israeli side, we're concentrating on the types of issues that I've talked about, social investment. I think we're on the brink of a revolution in the way in which we view social issues, and I think the role of philanthropy is about to go through a transformation, and it's been a great privilege for me to share these thoughts with you today, and I hope that we will be partners together in making it happen here and in your country. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, final announcements from Judy Mann, COO of Jewish Funders Network.
Hi, everyone. I think we're off to a great start. I'm always going to be here with important announcements, so be sure you pay attention to what I have to say. First of all, there's a misprint in the program book. Anytime it says that you're supposed to go to the 4th floor, you're supposed to go to M, the mezzanine or the meeting room floor. Next, you'll see outside when you're wandering around a group of kids from a high school in Or Yehuda called Masachim. This is a school for at-youth kids that focuses on full matriculation, but also on communications, and they're going to be doing interviews of people, video interviews of people, so we thank those of you who have said you would do it, and really encourage others of you to do it as well. It's all for internal use. And finally, we got off to a bit of a late start, which we really don't want to do in the future, so I want to very much encourage you. I know it's not quite the culture, but we really do need to stay on time here, or we're going to be just going crazy. So the sessions for the next group of workshops will start at 11:05, not at 11. Thank you. Go out, gab, talk to each other, have fun.